Subcommittee on Intergovernmental Affairs will come to order. Without objection, the presiding member is authorized to declare a recess at any time. The national debt recently reached $21.3 trillion. There's a debt clock in New York that is running at an extraordinarily rapid rate. The American people pay for that debt with interest. Last year, the government paid $371 billion in net interest. Without serious reforms in just 10 years, debt held by the public will increase by more than 80%, and net interest will nearly triple. This is unsustainable and unacceptable. We need to get the nation's fiscal house in order. Congress has both the authority and the responsibility to do so. Article 1 of the Constitution vests Congress with the power of the purse. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 says, "No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law and a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time." I would argue that we have not been faithful to at least Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 of the Constitution. Generally, Congress exercises its fiscal authority to determine and oversee federal spending through the annual appropriations process. However, over time, more and more spending has been put on autopilot. The Government Accountability Office calls this backdoor spending. Backdoor spending is federal agency spending not subject to congressional review in the annual appropriations process. Remember what Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 says, that there will be a regular statement account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money. Today, the GAO issued a new report on the scope and frequency of backdoor spending. According to the GAO, backdoor spending has increased by 88% since 1994. Federal agencies reported $3.2 trillion in backdoor spending in 2015. That's $3.2 trillion. As a comparison, the entire expenditure of the federal government was $3.7 trillion in 1994. The vast majority of federal spending is going out the door without any congressional oversight through the annual appropriations process. Of the $3.2 trillion on autopilot, $2.6 trillion was spent through permanent appropriations, such as entitlement programs like Medicare and interest payments on the debt. $421 billion was spent through offsetting collections, such as fines and fees and court settlements. And $178 billion was spent through contract and borrowing authorities. With the debt reaching unstable levels, out of control, unsustainable spending needs to be reined in. Congress cannot continue to shrug its shoulders and watch our nation collapse under the weight of our own reckless spending. We need to take every opportunity to identify, consider, and mandate reforms to get our fiscal house in order. It is our duty to the American people to align federal spending with public priorities, as the Constitution intends for Congress to do. This Congress, I introduced H.R. 850, the Agency Accountability Act of 2018. Under H.R. 850, fines, fees, penalties, and settlements agencies collect must be deposited in the Treasury's general fund to await an act of Congress before it can be spent. In 2015, that would have been $421 billion. Programs that currently have dedicated funding streams through fines, fees, and penalties will still operate, but would need to have the budgets appropriated by Congress. A substantial portion of backdoor spending is in the form of improper payments. Since 2003, improper payments have totaled about $1.4 trillion. For fiscal year 2017, federal entities sent out about $141 billion in improper payments. Of the $141 billion, Medicare, Medicaid, and the Earned Income Tax Credit accounted for about 74%. We're fortunate today to have with us a panel that can help us better understand backdoor spending in federal agencies and the challenges it poses to Congress. I thank the witnesses for being here today. I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Raskin, for his opening statement.
Chairman Palmer, thank you very much. Thank you for calling this important hearing, and also given that I suspect this is our last hearing for our subcommittee, I want to salute you on your very hard work and the intelligence and seriousness with which you've acted in this capacity. So I don't know what the future of our subcommittee is, but you certainly have acquitted yourself very well in chairing our panel. Let's see. I'm first asking permission, Mr. Chairman, to submit for the record the statement of Max Rickman, the President and CEO of the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare.
Without objection, so ordered.
I've got to say, I wasn't familiar with the phrase backdoor spending, I was reading about it at the same time it came on the news about the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York bringing or making the statements about President Trump's alleged backdoor payments to the mistresses through the campaign finance scheme they came up with. And I thought we were having a hearing on that. Nothing quite so sensational, I see. But it is interesting to me that the phrase backdoor spending is being used to describe what I see as our front door, top shelf commitment to the national programs of Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, and maybe somebody can explain, the derivation of that term. I know that that Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security are not subject to the regular annual appropriations process. They're funded by a formula that Congress has authorized, I think, for decades, and of course has the power to amend at any time. But under these rules, public money has been paid to Americans who qualify for Social Security or Medicare. It is paid in the overwhelming number of cases correctly, and it's paid on time. And tens of millions of Americans depend on that rather modest allotment, but they depend on it nonetheless for their basic material needs. And I don't think anyone wants to subject the financial security of some 62 million Americans who depend on Social Security and Medicare to the general vagaries and tugs of war that take place in the regular budget process. So the two principal drivers of increased permanent appropriation spending, as I understand it, are expanded eligibility due to age and population growth, and then the rising costs of health care. And of course, this news is not really news to anyone. The population was 263 million in 1994. Today, the population is around 326 million, and the baby boomers continue to age and retire, and the pharmaceutical drug companies continue to make profits at historic margins on the drugs that the population is dependent on. And so these are demographic trends and economic trends that are easily discernible, and we should talk about what we can do to make sure we can address them best as we can. Obviously, passing irresponsible tax cuts that explode the national deficit don't improve the picture, and we did that to the tune of $1.5 trillion, and so we have to figure out how to deal with that piece of fiscal foolishness. Meantime, I think that we should pursue this conversation in a way that recognizes the essential role that Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid play for large parts of the population, and for all of us to be able to express our commitment to the dignity and the security of every citizen. So I think we have an obligation to preserve these vital programs, as well as to address the fiscal issues that are on the table today. I look forward to the testimony of the witnesses, and I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I'm pleased to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Ms. Chris Wien. I practiced all night on your name. Director of Strategic Issues at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Ms. Julia C. Mata, Managing Associate General Counsel, Office of the General Counsel at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Mr. James Wallner, Senior Fellow at R Street Institute. And Mr. Robert Wiseman, President of Public Citizen. Welcome to you all. Pursuant to the committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. Please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? The record will reflect all witnesses answered in the affirmative. Please be seated. In order to allow time for discussion, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement will be made part of the official record. As a reminder, the clock in front of you shows the remaining time during your opening statement. The light will turn yellow when you have 30 seconds left and red when your time is up. Please also remember to press the button to turn your microphone on before speaking, and for some of you, if the microphone's away from you, pull it a little bit closer. I now recognize the gentlewoman, Ms. Nguyen, for 5 minutes.
Chairman Palmer, Ranking Member Raskin, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss our report that is being released at this hearing, entitled Federal Budget, Government-Wide Inventory of Accounts with Spending Authority and Permanent Appropriations, fiscal years 1995 to 2015. Not all federal funding is reviewed each year as part of the annual appropriations process. Congress can provide budget authority through laws other than annual appropriations acts or through permanent appropriations that permit the agency to obligate budget authority without further congressional action. Backdoor spending is a similar term that is used to describe this type of federal funding. Analysis of these authorities helps provide Congress with visibility into spending authority that is not considered during the annual appropriations process. My remarks today focus on federal agencies' reported use of these authorities from fiscal years 1995 through 2015. As you noted, Chairman, we found that a total of $3.2 trillion in spending authority and permanent appropriations was reported in fiscal year 2015. This is an increase of 88% from fiscal year 1994. As a result of the growth of these authorities, more budget authorities is available to agencies that does not require them to await congressional action to incur obligations. While our work covered several types of budget authority, permanent appropriations, which is the budget authority to incur payments and make obligations without further congressional action, were the primary driver of the growth. Permanent appropriations fund entitlement programs, such as the HHS Medicare and SSA's Old Age and Survivors and Disability Insurance programs. These programs represent a significant proportion of the authorities in our inventory in fiscal year 2015. In addition, these programs continue to show spending increases, largely as a result of the aging population and rising healthcare costs, and are projected to continue to increase in the future. Specifically, HHS reported the largest use of these authorities in fiscal year 2015, with about $979 billion, or about 30%. HHS' largest 3 accounts in our inventory all fund Medicare. SSA reported about $920 billion, or about 28%. SSA's largest 2 accounts in our inventory fund the Old Age and Survivors and Disability Insurance programs. In addition, Treasury reported the 3rd largest amount with about $542 billion, or 17%, the majority of which is for interest on debt held by the public or intergovernmental debt. These 3 agencies comprise 3/4 of the total government-wide authorities in fiscal year 2015. In addition to the growth in these authorities, we also found that in fiscal year 2015, 57% were exempt from sequestration, up from 37% in fiscal year 1994. Sequestration is the cancellation of budget resources, which helps to enforce spending limits and thereby control the deficit. When sequestration is in effect, agencies can continue to use these authorities without reductions and are permitted to obligate budget authority without further congressional action. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss our work related to backdoor spending.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Mata for her testimony.
I will not be giving a statement.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Wallner for his testimony.
Good morning, Chairman Palmer, Ranking Member Raskin, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the practice of backdoor spending and the challenges it presents. It is an honor to appear before you today. At the outset, I want to acknowledge that how Congress budgets technically adheres to the process outlined in the Constitution. That is, Congress must authorize by law both the collection of government revenues as well as their expenditure before agencies can spend money. Yet there are nevertheless problems with today's process. For starters, it makes it harder for members to discharge their constitutional duties in this act effectively. In general, its complexity obscures the real nature of today's dysfunction and inhibits efforts to fix it. And overall, the closed-door nature of budgeting makes it harder for members and the constituents they represent to evaluate budgetary decisions as they are made. Efforts to fix the broken process that aim only to make it more efficient won't fix ultimately how Congress budgets unless they also fix these underlying problems. And to be effective, reform efforts should be grounded in a clear understanding of what the act of budgeting actually entails. The federal government currently follows an obligation-based budget system. That is, when Congress approves new expenditures, it gives agencies budget authority to enter into obligations. And budget authority, as we know, takes one of two forms. It is either temporary, which is discretionary spending that is approved in the annual appropriations process, or it can be permanent. That's mandatory spending. It takes the form of authorization bills, and it occurs outside of the appropriations process. Backdoor spending, as has been noted, is the term used to refer to a broad array of programs funded by mandatory spending outside of the appropriations process. The GAO defines it as a, quote, colloquial phrase for budget authority provided in laws other than appropriations acts. CBO notes that there are one of four ways to spend backdoor spending, basically: borrowing authority, contract authority, entitlement authority, and authority to obligate and spend offsetting collections. So in my testimony, I use the term backdoor spending narrowly to refer only to offsetting collections, and I do so to better highlight the challenges to effective budgeting that the practice presents. The definition of offsetting collections, they're essentially fines, fees, penalties, and settlements that agencies are authorized by law to collect and spend without subsequent congressional action. They don't need further approval because they received permanent budget authority in prior laws. Yet Congress is not relinquishing its power to tax and spend. Like all permanent grants of budget authority, Congress retains the ability to conduct oversight and to change how offsetting collections operate in subsequent laws. And it usually does so by including obligation limitations in appropriations bills. There are benefits to appropriating money or to budgeting in this way. For the agencies, it gives them efficiency. It insulates the programs from the political process. It grants flexibility in program administration, and it insulates the agencies from congressional interference that would normally arise in the normal appropriations process. There are also benefits to members of Congress. For appropriators in particular, the practice allows for a gimmick known as changes in mandatory spending, or CHIMPs, that allows appropriators to artificially reduce the cost of appropriations bills and to spend that money elsewhere. It also allows members to avoid the responsibility to fund programs on an annual basis while grappling with problems like improper payments. With all this being said, there is a big impact on budgeting. This practice makes budgeting harder. It removes budgetary decisions from Congress. Such decisions are best made in Congress, not the administration. The allocation of scarce resources is implicit in the act of budgeting. It requires members to choose between competing demands and to prioritize. It generates conflict, and that conflict is ultimately resolved by a collective decision to compromise. And it is only in the Congress, not in the administration, where the people and their representatives come together on the basis of equality to resolve their differences and compromise. And to the extent that budgeting requires that to happen, budgeting must, and by definition, should occur in Congress, not the administration. The practice also inhibits Congress from fulfilling its responsibilities to tax and spend under the Constitution. It makes it harder for the citizens and rank-and-file members to evaluate budgetary decisions in real time. And overall, it's emblematic of the dysfunction in the broader budget process. It reflects a broader deference to the executive. Instead of dealing with the conflict that inevitably rises when members budget, members instead choose to defer to the executive to make those tough decisions, which is, by definition, not budgeting. It also makes it harder to use the power of the purse to rein in an executive who members of Congress believe has violated the law. There are a number of reform options that I look forward to discussing with you in your questions. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes Mr. Weissman for his testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee for having me today. And I want to thank you for focusing on the topic of mandatory appropriations, which is an important one and appropriate for Congress to pay attention to how the money is being spent. I wanted to make 4 brief points today. First, mandatory appropriations by their nature do not pose constitutional problems. They are carried out pursuant to the authority of Congress. The Constitution establishes Congress as the ultimate appropriator, and so long as that is being respected, mandatory appropriations do not themselves pose constitutional problems. It's worth noting that many of the characteristics of mandatory appropriations are also the same characteristics of tax policy, which lasts permanently until Congress intervenes, more or less, and most commonly, until Congress intervenes to change them. It is the same thing for mandatory appropriations. Second, not only is there not a constitutional issue with mandatory appropriations, using mandatory appropriations in general, but not always, is completely compatible with the spirit of the Constitution's tax and spend clause and the institution's obligation to carefully guard taxpayer monies and ensure that they are spent wisely. Congress, of course, may always alter mandatory spending, including in the course of any particular fiscal year. Certain elements of government action are more compatible with the model of mandatory appropriations, such as insurance programs, others perhaps less so, and Congress should be mindful of that. Third, if we're thinking about the deficit issue, the overwhelming share of mandatory appropriations occur from Medicare, Social Security, and payment of interest on the national debt. That's where the real money is. There are issues with each of those programs, and they need to be examined, but the problem is not their nature as mandatory appropriations, but the underlying issues involved with them. In the case of Medicare and Social Security, those are themselves both insurance programs, completely or partially, and fit well in general with the model of mandatory appropriations. But well beyond being insurance programs, Social Security and Medicare are covenants with the American people. Everyone understands that we are making obligations across generations and to individuals. Each of us pays into the system, each of us expects and is counting on that we will be paid out from the system in our retirement and senior years. Adjusting the mandatory spending in Social Security and Medicare would be a violation of a really sacred covenant between and among the American people. Fourth and finally, to say that mandatory appropriations are constitutionally proper and that the leading forms of mandatory appropriations should remain so is not to say that any particular mandatory appropriation should not be subject to reform. And of course, all of them should be subject to ongoing congressional monitoring and scrutiny. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned the issue of waste and improper spending in Medicare. I absolutely agree. It's a huge issue that requires a great deal of attention. I don't think that the issue of waste and improper spending and fraud in Medicare correlates to whether or not it's a mandatory appropriations program, and nor do the remedies. But I wanted to focus in my remaining moments on one particular reform that could save more than $10 billion easily for taxpayers on an annual basis, which would be to change the way Medicare deals with drug purchases. Medicare Part D, as you know, is prohibited from negotiating drug prices with drug manufacturers. That is a policy that came about through an unfortunate process in this Congress and makes no sense. The U.S. government grants monopolies, patent and other monopolies to drug manufacturers. It imposes upon itself the obligation to purchase products from the monopolists who have monopolies based on exclusivities conferred by the U.S. government, and then it denies itself the right to negotiate drug prices. It's absolutely certain in that circumstance what's going to occur, and that is that the American people are going to be price gouged, as in fact they are every single day, leading both to massive ripoffs and transfer of money from U.S. taxpayers and consumers to Big Pharma, but also to the rationing of life-saving medicines. We and colleagues have studied what would happen if Medicare paid not what it pays, but what the VA pays for drug pricing, because it does rely on negotiations. The answer is, in 2015, we would have saved, we, the American people, as taxpayers and consumers, $16 billion a year. This is a reform in mandatory appropriations that the Congress should get to the business of undertaking. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentleman for his testimony. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Nguyen, we hear the term offsetting collections. Can you give us a brief description? What are offsetting collections?
Offsetting collections refers to collections that are made, that are allowed to be deposited into the agency accounts, and the funds are available for the agency use without further legislative action.
All right. Your report finds that collections accounted for $421 billion in 2015, an increase of 126% from the fiscal year 1994 amount. Why was there such an increase, more than any other type of backdoor spending and offsetting collections over this time period?
We did not assess the range of reasons for the increases. It's important to note that there were 129 accounts with this new authority. There may be a range of reasons for that. It's noteworthy that the Post Office reported the largest use in 2015 with about $74 billion in revenue.
Right.
From
We're familiar with the numbers, just didn't know if you, so you really don't have any speculations on why they're increasing?
Julie, do you want to comment on the legal?
Yes, Representative Walker, the reasons can vary for each individual authority new authority that was enacted. We'd be happy to, if there's any particular authority that is of interest, we can look at that one in more detail.
We may follow up with some kind of questionnaire on that. Let me ask you, this is for both of you, do you expect this trend to continue?
I think we would need to look into that a little bit more when we look at, we're also releasing a data set that allows us to do a deeper analysis into the various accounts. So we'll be happy to work with you to look at that.
All right, so that's a lot of information that we've got to figure out a way to streamline. Let me change course. And how many agencies have offsetting collections authority?
We have a total of 902 accounts in total, 538 of which are offsetting collections.
Okay, and I think you said of those, the post office might be the largest. Is that what you said in just the previous comments? Okay. Are we always aware of where these collections are later being spent by the agency? Do we have good records for that?
The spending depends on the statutory authority that's given to the agency. For example, offsetting collections allow the agencies to spend the funds that are deposited into their account. However, with offsetting receipts, agencies require appropriations for Congress to do so.
I know you're sitting on that side of the dais, but I would ask you, how could Congress rein in agency authority to use offsetting collections? Have you any thoughts on that?
We did not. Our report does not provide recommendations. We provide a descriptive analysis of these authorities.
Okay. All right. Mr. Wallner, I'd like to ask you, GAO's report found that we're spending $2.6 trillion via permanent appropriations. Which agencies can spend without going through congressional review? And from your perspective, why is that so problematic? Two-part question there.
Well, my understanding is it's virtually every part of the federal government has some form of this authority, right? And I think there are two issues for why it's problematic. I think one is information that you all have as the representatives of the people as to what the government, their government, is doing. That's the first problem. And I think that the GAO report, I think, speaks to that. But as you've illustrated, we still lack a lot of information as to the granularity of the problem and the spending. But then the second problem, which I think doesn't often receive a lot of attention, is your ability to act on that information. And it is true that offsetting collections are able to be controlled by Congress in subsequent law. But ultimately, you have to act on it. And today, whenever there are obligation limitations and appropriations bills, they're often used as gimmicks, so far as I can tell. And what happens is if you have a legitimate concern and you want to offer an amendment or to include in a bill an obligation limitation, in my experience, what ultimately happens is that you're charged with shutting down the government, and your colleagues will oppose your efforts, not on the substance of your offsetting your obligation limitation, but on the fact that you trying to get a vote on that would shut down the government, and that limits your ability to act.
Thank you. Last question here, going back to Ms. Nguyen. Your report found that Health and Human Services, the Social Security Administration, and Treasury used the most permanent appropriations. What are the main examples of permanent appropriations within these agencies? And with that, I'll yield back.
The specific examples in those.
Can you just pause for a second? I'd like to address the chairman. My question is to Ms. Nguyen, I don't have a problem with Ms. Mata answering if that's something that's appropriate here. Is that okay? If we're okay with that, I have no issue with it. Okay, carry on, Ms. Mata.
All right.
Sure. I am the attorney on the job, so I'm helping Ms. Nguyen with the legal questions. The two main programs in those accounts with HHS, it's going to be Medicare under HHS, and for Social Security Administration, it'll be the old age and disability programs.
Thank you, Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Raskin, for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Weissman, I noted in your testimony your discussion of the current prohibition on negotiation for lower prescription drug prices in the Medicare program. Medicare Part D provides prescription drug coverage to more than 40 million Americans and is allocating over $137 billion a year on prescription drugs for serious medical conditions like diabetes and heart conditions and multiple sclerosis and cystic fibrosis and so on. In the VA program, we can negotiate for lower drug prices. In the Medicaid program, as you observe, we can negotiate for lower drug prices. Why can the government not negotiate for lower drug prices in the Medicare program?
A provision was included in the creation of Medicare Part D, the so-called non-interference clause that prohibits Medicare from negotiating Part D drug prices.
Okay, and what is your sense of the public policy rationale for that?
There is no public policy rationale. It was just purely a gift and a giveaway to Big Pharma. As I mentioned, you cannot rationally justify the government granting monopolies to Big Pharma corporations, then imposing upon itself an obligation to buy products from those monopolists, and then forbidding itself from negotiating price with the very same monopolists whose monopoly was granted by the government in the first place.
So what's the fiscal impact of this restriction on the ability of the government to pursue a market principle and to negotiate for lower drug prices?
Well, we massively overpay, and that's the we who overpay is both the government and individual seniors, as well as seniors who go without medicines because they can't afford them. We were able to compare the prices paid by Medicare Part D in 2015 with the prices paid by the VA in 2015 and found if Medicare had been able to get the lower prices of the VA, it would have saved $16 billion a year. That is for sure a low estimate of what could be now saved by Medicare if we're able to engage in negotiations.
In other words, you compared what was spent by the Medicare Part D program on the exact same drugs that were spent by the VA and found that had we been able to charge the same amount or only the same amount in the Medicare Part D program as was charged to the VA, there would be a $16 billion savings to the American people?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's 2015, so the number would be bigger now because we spend more on drugs now than we did then. And there's every reason to expect that Medicare could negotiate prices lower than the VA. Medicare Part D represents 7% of the global market for pharmaceuticals, 7% of the entire world market for pharmaceuticals, and we just pay the monopolist price. We take it.
Well, and what do you think are the prospects for our changing that? President Trump has said he favors giving the government the power to negotiate for lower prescription drug prices, right?
President Trump has said that. His Secretary of Health and Human Services has a different point of view.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes Mr. Grothman, the gentleman from Wisconsin, for 5 minutes.
Yeah, theoretically, and this is for Ms., I'm not sure how to pronounce your name again. I've heard it a couple times. When. All federal spending should be authorized. Did the GAO confirm that all these all this backdoor spending was authorized?
Yes, our process of confirming the statutory authority required us to work with agencies to identify both the amount and statutory references. And when possible, we verified this information against the President's budget.
How many spending authorities did Congress create, say, over the last 20 years? Do you know about?
As I mentioned earlier, we have a total of 902 accounts.
And can you give me some examples of the biggest ones? Rattle off some of the biggest ones.
In our report, we identified the biggest driver of the growth is permanent appropriations, and specifically HHS, SSA, with their Medicare and old age and survivor and disability insurance programs are among the top spending authorities. And in addition to that, Treasury is the third in line. Collectively, those three agencies make up 75% of spending authority and permanent appropriations.
I take it by the Treasury you mean interest on the government debt?
Yes.
Okay. Don't know if I should be asking this, or maybe you're not prepared for it. Obviously, the last 2 years have been bad years for people who don't want to see an increase in government spending. Do you know, has this backdoor spending gone up quicker or discretionary spending gone up quicker? Okay, I guess what I'm saying is, well, first of all, I'll ask you this. How much has discretionary, or what we're going to refer to here is, how much has backdoor spending gone up per year the last couple of years?
As I mentioned earlier, backdoor spending is a general term that's referring to appropriations that occur outside of the annual appropriations process.
Correct.
And our definition of spending authority is the authority that is made available outside of the annual appropriations process.
Right, right. How much has that gone up per year the last?
The increase collectively is 88% from 1994.
Right, but the last couple of years. How much has it gone up
For that level of information, I would need to get back to you on that.
Okay. I'll tell you what I'd like you to do. I'd like to find out, for the last couple of years, both the increase in what I guess we could call mandatory spending or backdoor spending, and the increase of appropriations, and see for the last 2 years what overall has happened. You've said Congress amended some backdoor spending authorities. Can you give me some examples of spending authorities that Congress has expanded in the last few years?
Julie, do you want to?
One good example, Representative Grothman, would be the National Flood Insurance Fund. They reported an increase of about 878 million in offsetting collections in 2012 after legislation increased the annual limitation on premium increases for certain insurance premiums.
Okay. You said GAO confirmed that the programs are authorized. Have any authorizations ever lapsed?
Yes, during that period of time, some authorizations did lapse. The other point that I want to let you know is that out of the approximately 1,000 authorities, we were unable to confirm about 28 authorities with individual agencies. As our report is issuing publicly today, we are planning to refer those particular accounts to the appropriate authorizing and appropriations committees in case they wish to exercise further oversight. We attempted to confirm those with the agencies on our own and working with them. We were unable to identify whether it was an improper use of an authority or whether the data in that particular account coming from the OMB database that we used perhaps had an error in it. But we were unable in those particular accounts to confirm the authority. So the vast majority we did, but there was a small part that we did not.
Okay, I see my time is up, so I will send things back to our chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Before I recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Raskin had to move over to a judiciary hearing meeting, and I told him that I was going to say some very nice things about him, and now he's leaving. But I'll say about him in absentia. He has been a very good colleague, a very intelligent guy, and I think does a really good job, and I hope the new majority sees fit to allow this committee to continue to operate and for him to be ranking member. No disrespect at all to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Cartwright, who would be very able as the ranking member as well. And with that, I now recognize Mr. Cartwright for his questions for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you for the kind words about Mr. Raskin. I'll be sure and pass them on if he doesn't hear them otherwise. Well, I came here looking at the title of this hearing, Examining Backdoor Spending, and I thought, wow, that sounds terrible. We can't have backdoor spending in the United States. And then what I found out was that's being used interchangeably with mandatory spending. And what people need to realize is that when we talk about mandatory spending, we're talking about Social Security and Medicare, aren't we, Mr. Weissman? Let the record reflect Mr. Weissman is nodding in the affirmative. We're talking about Medicare and Social Security, and calling that backdoor spending is probably a mistake because of all the great Americans that depend on these programs. What we're talking about when we say mandatory spending is a legally authorized expenditure that Congress has debated, amended, and approved in the open through the committee procedure and floor action and signed by the President. Now, do any of our witnesses disagree with that statement? They're all saying no, Mr. Chairman. And let me ask you this. Does anybody here think mandatory appropriations like Social Security or Medicare are unconstitutional? Again, let the record reflect all of our witnesses are shaking their heads in the negative. Yet here we are. Here we are having a hearing about backdoor spending, which is used interchangeably with mandatory spending, as if there's something wrong, something improper going on here. Mr. Weissman, last year, congressional Republicans passed a tax cut package, 83% of which was a massive tax giveaway to the richest 1% of the people in the country and the corporations. Yet here we are, 1 year after President Trump signed that tax cut into law, discussing safety net program that all Americans pay into and benefit from. Mr. Weissman, did the GOP tax cut plan reduce government budget deficits, or did the GOP tax cut plan make deficits worse?
It made them worse. It also actually increased mandatory spending because the increase in the debt will mean more interest payments, and that will actually raise the mandatory spending that's the subject of today's hearing.
Sure. So if you don't like mandatory spending and you're prone to call it something pejorative like backdoor spending, that tax cut made it worse, didn't it?
That's correct.
In fact, the Republican tax cuts added $1.5 trillion to budget deficits over the next 10 years, didn't they, Mr. Weissman?
That's correct.
Now, the fiscal year 2019 House Republican budget resolution sought to cut Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and the ACA by $2 trillion. Am I correct in that?
I believe that's right.
And if Republicans had had their way, reductions to safety net programs that protect vulnerable Americans would directly fund those tax cuts, 18% of which benefit only the top 1%. Mr. Weissman, what consequences would beneficiaries of the safety net programs that I've mentioned face with multi-trillion-dollar cuts in funding?
Well, it would be absolutely devastating, as you well know. About half of all Social Security beneficiaries rely on Social Security payments for at least half of their annual income. About 1 in 5, just for about 1 in 5, Social Security represents 90% or more of their income. And of course, when it comes to Medicare, most retirees have no possible way of affording their health care if they're not fully insured by Medicare.
So if you like Social Security and Medicare, that means you like mandatory spending. Is that a fair statement?
At least one colleague on the panel might disagree, but I would say that's a fair statement, yes.
Here's the point. People count on these programs. Mandatory spending is constitutional, it is legal, it is properly authorized by Congress, and there's nothing wrong with it. American taxpayers have a right to the government program benefits that they have paid into their entire lives. I implore my colleagues across the aisle to get real about protecting our citizens and ensuring they have the vital services and programs that they need to survive. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I will now recognize myself for questions, and I'd like to point out that the issue, this whole issue of backdoor spending is the nomenclature from the general, the GAO. It's not a Republican issue. It is an issue of the American people. And in that regard, do you think there's a problem with doing oversight on all federal programs, Mr. Wiseman?
No, sir. As I mentioned in my
Well,
testimony repeatedly, absolutely, it's an affirmatively good thing you're doing it.
Well, if there's not a problem with it, then what's the big deal about having a hearing on backdoor spending and whatever you want to call it? It's not appropriations, because in all due respect to the gentleman from Pennsylvania's point, it is authorized, but it's authorized by past Congresses. They basically put it on autopilot, took away the, and we, and I say we collectively, Democrat and Republican in Congress, have been perfectly content to sit back and let it continue on autopilot and not exercise the oversight authority that we're supposed to exercise. This is not about cutting spending. It's about making a better use of the money that we have. You brought up the Medicare Part D, although this hearing's not about that, but I will point out that last year we had $1.3 billion in improper payments. That's $1.3 billion didn't get to the people who needed it for drug coverage. I would like to introduce this into the record, and since I'm the chairman, without objection, I'm the only one here, so ordered. We'll have some others like that. Do you agree that we ought to be responsible stewards for the tax dollars of the American people, Mr. Wiseman?
I agree with that in general. I agree with
Well,
the value
good.
of oversight of these things, and I agree with the importance of focusing on waste and fraud and Medicare.
That puts you in complete agreement with President Obama. Among the promises that President Obama made when he campaigned for office was more accountability in government. You can't have accountability without an appropriations process. When you put it on autopilot, you're basically not paying attention. I mean, it's not like a driverless car. I mean, you have to exercise oversight. So on July 22nd, 2010, President Obama signed a bill, the Improper Payments Elimination Recovery Act. It was all about reducing the amount of waste and fraud and improper payments. In my opening testimony, I pointed out that 74% of the $141 billion in improper payments was Medicare, Medicaid, and the Earned Income Tax Credit. Of that, $72.9 billion was just Medicare and Medicaid. For the life of me, I can't understand why my colleagues cannot put the politics aside, why some of the people who have testified before this committee can't put the politics aside and work with some of us who seriously want to resolve the issue. That's $72.9 billion that didn't get to the proper places. Some of it's fraud, some of it's waste, administrative error. This is something I've worked on for practically the entire time I've been in Congress, working with the GAO. No political agenda, just trying to get our fiscal house in order. And I can tell you right now, if we continue on autopilot, we're going to go in the ditch. It's going to be a catastrophe for the country. So when we talk about backdoor spending or whatever you want to call it, What we're really talking about is exercising fiscal oversight so that we can get a handle on this. Not about reducing anybody's payment. It's making proper use. It's exercising the constitutional authority that we have, that we've, I think, abdicated to a previous Congress. And it's easy to sit here and say, well, that this is all legal, but one Congress can't bind another. One Congress should not even attempt to bind another, and no Congress should concede its authority to a previous Congress, which is basically what we've done. I just want to point out, and I want to introduce the President's press release on the Improper Payments Elimination Recovery Act into the record without objection, so ordered. This has to be one of the highest priorities that we have. You got to start somewhere. I mean, $141 billion a year in 10 years, that's $1.4 trillion. When we get into some of the other issues that we're talking about here, the $421 billion in fines and fees and other things, Mr. Wallner, you were asked earlier what your recommendations would be on that. I would suggest that the bill that I introduced, the Agency Accountability Act, would go a long way in addressing that issue, because it would require that all of these funds, all non-appropriated revenues, go to the Treasury, identified with the agency where they originated, subject to being appropriated by Congress. There's not one word in the entire bill that would even give any indication whatsoever that we would deny these funds from an agency. They just need to be constitutionally appropriated, and constitutional oversight needs to be exercised. What are your comments on that?
I think your legislation is a great first place to start. In fact, it's the only piece of legislation that I've seen that would really try to jump in and tackle this problem. And it would, in essence, force your colleagues to budget. It would force them to prioritize funding. My understanding is that Social Security and Medicare or Medicaid are broadly supported programs, and they're not impacted by your legislation right now. As far as offsetting collections go, the vast majority of Americans don't know what these things are. That doesn't mean that they won't support them, but I think that they have a right and an expectation that their representatives in Congress are going to debate these programs. And if members disagree about them, then that will elevate the issue, and then the American people ultimately get to decide. But putting it on autopilot, as you say, removes that decision from them, and it removes it from you. And I think your legislation would go a long way towards correcting that practice.
Ms. Nguyen, and Ms. Mott, I want to thank the GAO for the excellent work that they've done on this. You don't need to comment on this, but my perception of this is that the GAO is doing this in the context of helping us achieve some fiscal stability and some fiscal accountability. There's no politics involved. I don't think anyone came up with the name backdoor spending. I think that predates anyone in this room. That term's been around for a long time. I think it was first used maybe in 1994, 1995, somewhere. So this is not a new creation. But Ms. Nguyen, your report notes that 57% of the backdoor spending is not subject to sequester. That's up from 37% in 1994. I'm concerned about the $2.6 trillion of the permanent appropriations. What does it mean for permanent appropriations to be sequestrable?
I will defer the question on sequestration to my general counsel.
Thank you.
Yes, Chairman Palmer. So if an account is not subject to sequestration, basically the Balanced Budget Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1985, BBEDCA, as has been amended, in particular by the Budget Control Act of 2011 and other laws, sets out a process for the executive branch to order a reduction or cancellation in budgetary resources to achieve some deficit reduction targets. So that act looks through the lens of discretionary and mandatory spending and directs OMB and the President to order those sequestrations in those two buckets of types of accounts. So on the mandatory side, when we're talking about those being exempt from sequestration or otherwise limited in the amount that can be sequestered, it really is talking about what percentage or what amount an agency can no longer execute on that account that would then help towards deficit reduction.
Well, and again, when we're talking about this, most people, they hear the word sequester, they get really nervous, but we're not talking about cuts. We're trying to look at the overall problem with not appropriating and not exercising oversight. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, so a sequester technically is a reduction in the amount that the agency would have available to spend. And again, the articulated goal in the legislation is to achieve certain deficit reduction targets for Congress.
Okay. Mr. Wallner, you've done a good bit of work on the deficit and debt reduction. I want to go back to some of these issues that we're trying to deal with. Again, I've made this comment several times, that the real problem with dealing with the deficit is the failure to do appropriations. Without trying to give my colleagues in the House too much credit, but we've done our appropriations, but when they go to the Senate, they die. And we wind up passing continuing resolutions or omnis. Would you agree that it makes it virtually impossible to exercise fiscal oversight as long as we don't do appropriations?
I do.
Any suggestions?
Well,
Other than do our job, do what the Constitution calls on us to do?
and I would like the record to reflect that I think you and your colleagues in the House have done an excellent job with regard to passing appropriations bills in recent years, and the Senate has not. And I think a large part of that is this unwillingness to budget, an unwillingness to deal with the conflict that arises in the process and the act of budgeting. Your legislation is a great first step. I think there are other ways to deal with this. That fall short of that. Mandatory spending doesn't have to be on autopilot. There's lots of mandatory programs that are reauthorized periodically over several years, right? Farm bill, highway bill, those things. And so you could take offsetting collection authorities and treat them the same way. You could create, specifically with regard to the Senate, special points of order in the budget process to give individual members an ability to kind of force their way into the conversation, to give them leverage to negotiate with their colleagues over obligation limitations, rather than being told now, don't even think about doing that. There may be problems, there may be fraud, there may be waste, but don't think about doing that because there'll be a government shutdown, and we can't even bother with that. But if you give them the ability to make a point of order against any appropriation bill that would fund an agency that receives offsetting collections, then that would give them a lot of leverage to kind of force their way into the conversation. So there's lots of ways to think creatively about this, and I think, again, your legislation is a good first place to start, but there needs to be a general decision that your colleagues make, that this is the place where they budget, not the administration, not some bureaucracy somewhere that the people can't interact with and deal with on a regular basis. This is the place where they hold their government accountable. And if budgeting doesn't happen here, then budgeting isn't happening in a way that can be held accountable.
Well, with all due respect, and I'd say it if my colleagues were here, I think there's a certain amount of hypocrisy that we're witnessing here. And that's one of the reasons why I think they try to make the issue about cutting Social Security. Nobody's talking about cutting Social Security, about cutting Medicaid or Medicare. Nobody's talking about that. We're talking about trying to get control of our fiscal future that is going to impact everybody in this room, particularly the younger people. And I think an example of that is we had a select committee on reforming the budget. We're talking about some serious reforms going to two-year budgets. We're talking about working with the Senate to figure out a way to make appropriations privileged so that they're not held hostage to a 60-vote margin. And when they brought that to a vote, it didn't pass out of the select committee. Three of my Democrat colleagues voted present. I mean, to me, that's rank hypocrisy. That's all about politics. Give you another example of that is when it was a Democrat-controlled House and Senate that passed the Improper Payments Elimination and Recovery Act that the President signed, that I just introduced his press release into the record. Yet there was no enforcement in the legislation. They passed the second bill, no enforcement in the legislation. That indicates to me a lack of seriousness for this. And then the Inspector General puts out a report that the Obama administration gave out $434 million in improper payments on Obamacare. This came out in August of this year. That indicates to me a serious example of hypocrisy, a demonstrated lack of seriousness. Really, it's all about politics. Some of us realize that truly the future of the country is at stake, and that we have an obligation to do all that we can, regardless of Democrat or Republican. We're all going to own it one day, and the burden's going to be left on future generations to bear this, and it's going to have an impact on Social Security. And this coming around and saying, well, you got to, you know, the tax cuts went to the rich, that's false to begin with. I'm from Alabama, and I can assure you the people in Alabama, the middle income, lower income people, are appreciative of the tax cuts and the job creation. But, you know, that's all politics. I hope that at some point in the very near future that this Congress is going to take seriously its constitutional responsibility to do appropriations and to do oversight. And until we do, we're not going to solve this problem. And that window for getting it solved, despite all of the great work being done by the GAO and other organizations, Ms. Nguyen, Ms. Mata, will bear no fruit until we get serious about it. I thank our witnesses again for appearing before us today. The hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks for any member to submit a written opening statement or questions for the record. If there's no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.